healthy and safe and taking the time they need to stay that way. My name is Andrea Ray, and I have the pleasure to serve as the President CEO at the Seattle-Southside Chamber of Commerce. And on behalf of our board and staff, welcome to our fourth SMART Southside Mitigation and Recovery Task Force webinar on logistics and trade. Our webinar series is a strategic initiative dedicated to our mission at our chamber to connect, convene, and create economic opportunity for South King County. We're grateful that you can join us today. Anyone that has tried to buy toilet paper in the last few weeks has experienced what happens when there are disruptions in our supply chain. We've gathered industry experts today to share their thoughts about current supply chain issues, as well as what we might be looking at in the future so that our businesses and our community can be positioned well for recovery. Today, you'll hear from Sam Kaplan, Director of the Center of Excellence for Global Trade and Supply Chain Management at Highline College, Sheri, Executive Vice President with the Washington Trucking Association, Tom Green, Head of Air Cargo for SeaTac Airport, Steve Balaskai, Senior Business Manager, Northwest Seaport Alliance. Each speaker will share their thoughts. We'll pause after their brief presentation to answer any questions that you might have directly for that speaker. Please know that if we don't get to your question, we will try to follow up after the webinar today with an email. We are scheduled to go until 1 p.m. today, so we certainly hope that we'll be able to get to all of your questions. Each week, SMART will present a new topic on a subject impacting our community. Next week, we hope you'll join us as we look at how the retail sector has and will continue to adapt. You can register for all of our webinars at our website, seattle-southsidechamber.com. We know providing opportunities to share information and connect will make our community stronger and ready for recovery. We hope you can join us for more of these opportunities. And if you or your company is able to donate or sponsor our work so that we can continue to serve our community in and through this challenge, it would be greatly appreciated. Every little bit helps to keep our nonprofits strong and to continue to help serving our community. So thank you. I'm now going to turn it over to Renata Emerson. She is our manager for membership and programs. And thank you, Renata. She's going to tell us a little bit about housekeeping for what we can expect with the webinar. So Renata?
Thank you, Andrea. So again, thank you. I'm just going to piggyback on what Andrea said. Thank you for being here, part of this webinar. A few things as we just get started. I want to make sure that you can most optimally see what the presenters are wanting to show. So if you can make sure that you are in gallery mode, and you do that by taking your cursor up to the top right of your screen, and it will either say speaker view or it will say gallery mode. If it says speaker view, then click on it and it will change to gallery mode. And now you will see my face, primary, front and center on your screen, and you'll see the rest of our presenters up at the top. Just if you have it in speaker view, you will always see all of the speakers kind of equal, divided on your screen, and you won't be able to fully see the presentation. So gallery view is the option that you want at this time. Next, I want to call to attention the Q&A feature at the bottom. And so that's what we'll be using today to, for you guys to submit any questions that you have. You can submit them at any time, and we'll definitely make a point to monitor and address those. But you'll bring your mouse down to the bottom of your screen and click Q&A, and it'll pop up a window that allows you to type in your question. And I personally will be monitoring that. And so there will be designated times after presentations where we address your questions. In addition to that, there is a raise hand option. And so say we're in the Q&A portion and there was a follow-up to your question, or if you needed to make a clarification, you can virtually raise your hands. And you do that by first clicking on the participant icon at the bottom of the screen there. And you'll see the list of panelists. You'll also see the list of attendees. You should see your name there. And at the bottom of that, there's an option to raise hand, to mute yourself. And if you guys see that and you're able to raise your hand, you can give it a test real quick. Joyce has raised her hand. Well done. Fantastic. So that's an option for you as well, just to get my attention and say, hey, I need to ask something. I'm going to assume that all of these are tests. And so I will put hands down at this time. Thank you very much. And one last thing, all participants, all attendees are muted and will stay muted for the time being. We'll be addressing Q&A primarily through the text Q&A feature. If there is something, if a panelist does want some clarification and we want to kind of move it a little quickly, then I will monitor or moderate unmuting particular attendees based on who's raised their hand in that thing. And so just know that you will be muted the entire time. And with that, I will turn it back over to Andrea to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Renata. And so again, we're grateful for our first speaker, Sam Kaplan, to share with us his thoughts, insights on what's happening right now in our world. So Sam, take it away.
All you are doing during these confusing, challenging times. So I'm going to give kind of a brief overview and then sort of a 30,000-foot picture, and then we'll turn it over to some people who are really in the trenches on this stuff. Go ahead and bring up the first slide if you can. In late December, I was just finishing a first draft of a book I'm writing about China and the United States. So I was paying even closer attention to China than usual when word first started appearing about a new pneumonia-like disease spreading in Wuhan. I even wrote about it in my weekly newsletter on January 9th. And then I watched as China imposed a then unprecedented lockdown and its economy essentially came to a complete stop. With production greatly slowed, buyers all over the world began to scramble to look for alternative suppliers to keep product in their warehouses and up on their shelves. In mid-February, I had drinks with a friend of mine at Chuck's Hop Shop up in North Seattle. If you ever get a chance when they're back reopened, please head on over there and support them. And I told my friend that supply chains would change more by what we now call COVID-19 than by any other event since September 11th. And of course, since then, the world has changed tremendously as the pandemic has spread. Next slide, please. I'm actually not seeing the slide. I see you, Andrea. Is that what I should be seeing, or should I be seeing the slide?
Good question. I thought people should be seeing the slide, so.
Sorry to interrupt, just want to make sure it was all working.
Yeah.
Andrea, you'll need to re-slide share. There you go.
There we go. Thank you so much. So companies were already diversifying out of China due to high labor costs in the US-China trade war, as you can see in this slide here. But the pandemic is accelerating that trend. And whatever my personal views of US trade policy the last 3 years, and I think of the policies like I do the Seattle Mariners' efforts to make the playoffs the last 19 years, it's likely that diversifying supply chain as a result of the trade war was helpful when China was shut down because we were already getting some diversification in our supply chain. But remember, however, that diversification out of China was already happening before the trade war. Next slide, please. The pandemic, as I say, is accelerating that trend. Japan is already subsidizing Japanese manufacturers to return to Japan or to locate in other parts of Southeast Asia, spending around 200 billion yen to do so. And even globalization fan, President of France, Macron, says supply chains will have to become more French, from food to pharma. So trade is probably going to change over the next few years. Next slide, please. Of course, people have been predicting the death of globalization since perhaps the 1999 WTO riots, which took place here in lovely old Seattle area. For decades, trade grew at a faster rate than GDP, as you can see in the left part of this slide, or this chart. After the financial crisis, trade often grew slower than GDP, and some wondered whether globalization was slowing. The Trump administration slapping tariffs on anything that moved led to even more speculation of globalization slowing down. But starting in 2017, as you can see in the right part of this chart, trade started growing faster than GDP again. So policies and a variety of trends did not slow trade and globalization, but a little tiny virus has, at least temporarily. Trade is cratered due to the worldwide drop in demand, and that due to our various shelter-in-place policies that are happening all over the world. Of course, globalization is more than trade in goods and services. It's also connectedness through the internet, financial flows, and immigration. The first two, internet connectedness and financial flows, are probably happening even more during the pandemic, although financial flows have been chaotic during the pandemic. But trade is a big part of globalization, and it's been severely affected by the pandemic and the responses to it. Next slide, please. Trade has begun to plummet, and the next few quarters to perhaps years likely to be relatively scary. China has continued to reopen its economy, but its economy is not growing. They've been hit by the worldwide drop in demand. Until the major economies are able to reopen, no single country can expect full economic growth. In this chart, you're seeing three scenarios that the World Trade Organization has mapped out. Green is the optimistic scenario, red is the pessimistic scenario. Bottom line, WTO, the World Trade Organization, believes world merchandise trade is set to plummet by between 13 and 32% in 2020 due to the pandemic. Nearly all regions of the world are going to suffer double-digit declines in trade volumes in 2020, they're prognosticating. The hope is for a rebound in 2021, but that's dependent more on medical researchers than trade and logistics experts. In other words, we need effective treatments and a vaccine, or perhaps solutions more flexible than sheltering in place, and perhaps test and trace, which a lot of people are finally now talking about, will be that solution. My biggest worry locally is transportation. I have a hard time seeing the airline travel will recover, and as Boeing and its hundreds and hundreds of suppliers recover until there's an effective treatments or a vaccine are developed. A poll recently showed that 70% of sports fans aren't going to go back to arenas until there's a vaccine. Do we think these people will just get on flights instead of going to see sports? I think that's highly unlikely. Next slide, please. How this all is going to shake out is impossible to say, certainly not until we have a better handle on the virus itself. And even public health officials, epidemiologists, data experts, and others are talking about the extreme heterogeneity of the data. That's data on infections, on deaths, on hospitalizations, and even on assessing the impact of the various governmental responses to the pandemic. All of this data is very confusing. But regardless, supply chains will change significantly in the coming months and years. There are real concerns of food and other supply shortages in the coming months. Next slide, please. But supply chains have much to teach us as the world works to mitigate and recover from the pandemic. Supply chains are all about coordination and working together for the greater whole. There's currently a lot of pushback against globalization and globalized supply chains. Our globalized world might have made a pandemic more possible, although 1918 says, "Hold my Corona beer." But a globalized response is the only way out of the pandemic. One country cannot solve their way out of the pandemic. It will take the world working together to do that. Supply chains, they're certainly strained, especially medical supply chains, but they're evolving to meet the challenge. 2 weeks ago, I was at a grocery store and the ice cream aisle was cleaned out. And I watched a couple looking at the empty shelves, and the husband exclaimed, "Oh no, this is worse than the toilet paper shortage." This is a photo of that empty ice cream shelves. I actually sympathize with the husband. I think ice cream may be a worse shortage than toilet paper. But this week I noticed the ice cream shelves are restocked. Next slide, please. Supply chains will lead us out of the current crisis, including ones for the vaccine that will eventually be developed and then need to be distributed worldwide. So I suggest as you listen to the rest of our presentations, keep yourself up a big bowl of dulce de leche ice cream and be happy that our supply chains are working as well as they are. And there's literally millions of people out there in the supply chain industry and our manufacturers and food providers making sure that we are getting what we need to get. I'm now going to hand it over to three people who are in the trenches and really can give us some great details on what's going on. We're going to start with Steve Balaskai. He's the Senior Business Manager of the Northwest Seaport Alliance. Steve brings over 20 years of international and domestic experience in marine transportation and logistics. His background also includes operations, project management, marketing, and business development. And I believe he also likes to hike and run, which I'm sure he's doing in a safe distance from other runners and hikers in our current environment. But Steve's going to really give us some information about what's going on in the maritime trade world. Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Sam, and thank you for the invitation to share a few words about what's going on in the maritime world. Again, Steve Balaskai with the Northwest Seaport Alliance, and just real briefly for those of you who are not as familiar with our organization, the Alliance is a joint venture between the ports of Seattle and Tacoma. We were formed in 2015. So we are now managing all the cargo terminal assets on behalf of what are now called the home ports of Tacoma and Seattle. So my focus is on the container industry. So if you see those ships, big ships coming in to Puget Sound with all those containers, that's where I spend a lot of my time. So my comments will be focused on that part of the industry, and Tom's going to touch on the air freight side. So just had a couple visuals to share, and go ahead and go to the next one. So again, we're focused on the container industry, and this is just some stats of what we're seeing in our part of the industry and kind of a macro level. The key call out for my world and our focus is that what's the blank sailings. So what a blank sailing means is basically the ship isn't coming into port. So if you think of the airline world, they've scaled back. If you wanted to fly from here to Tokyo, they canceled that flight. It's the same concept on the water side. So, and what drove that initially, and this blank sailings aren't new. Traditionally, in the first part of the year, a lot of carriers will scale back their sailings just because there's less volume. There is some seasonality to our industry. So in the first quarter, unfortunately, though, that was exacerbated by what Sam referenced in terms of, China basically shut down. So there was no cargo moving out of China and other ports. So to manage their capacity, the ocean carriers adjusted their sailings accordingly. So in the first quarter of this year, we saw a dramatic increase of blank sailings, and what that meant was less import cargo coming in. So think of the retail outlets where you go to the store to get your clothes or hardware, things like that. They weren't flowing in. In April, we're anticipating. April's been kind of a return to quote unquote normal in terms of weekly schedules, which is a good thing. We've seen cargo start to flow because those same containers are needed for our exporters. We're fortunate in the Northwest, so we have a very large and robust export industry. Think of your apples, frozen French fries, lumber, and hay for feed. So they rely on the import containers to use to go back export-wise. Unfortunately, we're now seeing the effect. If you want to go to the next slide, please. This is a chart of most of the container activity inbound to the Northwest is from Asia, and this chart just reflects basically to the US what the volumes have been. And as you can see, Q1 has been a steady decline year over year. And again, that's a reflection of what's going on, China being shut down. But now what we're seeing is with the economy of the US being shut down for an extended period of time, the demand side is now being impacted. So we're now seeing an increased announcement of additional blank sailings in the May and June timeframe because importers are canceling their orders. Apparel is not selling right now, and so those orders aren't being made in China, so there's no demand for the ocean transportation. So that's something we're watching closely, and unfortunately something that will probably continue into the second quarter, and we'll just have to see about the third and the fourth quarter. Next slide. Actually, you can skip over this one. Sam kind of touched on this. Actually, stay on the slide if you don't want. If you go back to that just real quickly, because the bottom part of the last slide, if you can, that's just kind of a quick, real high level. This is basically the supply chain, if you will, for getting goods to and from manufacturing locations to end users. So, all of these links in the chain are being impacted by lack of volume. And so you think the railroads are definitely preparing for lack of volume in the coming months. And that's just a direct impact of demand. So last slide, please. So on a brighter note, what are we doing about this? So the good news from our perspective is the ports remain open. Business has been more or less operating as normal, so the ships have been able to come in. Our labor force is showing up to work. Trucks are able to get in and out of our terminals to pick up containers and deliver containers for export. So we're very thankful of our truckers who continue to work, of the labor force that continues to come to work, because without those groups, then we would really be in a serious situation. From the Alliance perspective, from a safety perspective, the terminals have taken enhanced measures to make sure they're cleaning, they're sanitizing, so that it minimizes the risk to the workers that are there. Safety is become very, very important at the terminals. And from a communication standpoint, we've actually started a weekly webinar that is hosted by our CEO. And it's basically what we're doing now. We're using this same technology so that our stakeholders can attend, and we do a live Q&A, and we provide a live update on what's going on, so that our customers and partners can understand live what is actually happening, because there's a lot of information out there and it's not all accurate. So we're trying to answer those specific questions so that there's some assurance that the supply chain is moving, and we're preparing for the post-COVID, what we hope is a stronger Q3, Q4. So when volumes return, we're ready to be, the supply chain's ready for it. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it very much. We are going to next go to Tom Green. Whenever I want to know about air cargo, I always turn to Tom. He's the head of air cargo at the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. He's also a fellow North Seattle resident. And once we're reopened, he and I are looking forward to going to some North Seattle coffee shops and bars and to talk in person. But Tom's going to be able to talk about the air cargo side of the thing. So Tom, let's turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Sam. And yeah, I'm looking forward to being able to get out again and go to bars and restaurants. And yeah, I was reminded of Chuck's there when you mentioned it. Yep, be very happy to get back there. Thanks, Steve, for the primer on the ocean side. As Steve noted, our ocean seaport is has a very large import component. And so when we look at it from a supply chain perspective, particularly with Asia, we can see not only the virus impacts directly as it relates to demand on this side, but as it relates to the manufacturing economy in China. I don't have any visuals here, any charts, so we'll just go with my remarks that I have. So folks may have heard, it's been out there in the news that our passenger numbers at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport are way down, as much as 90% less folks moving through the airport and flying. And so that means there's far fewer passenger airplanes that are flying. So analogous to blank sailings, pretty much every airline is way down on the number of passenger planes that they're flying into SeaTac. So on the air cargo side, why does this matter? We're talking about boxes, not people. Well, it turns out that fully a third of all the air cargo that moves through SeaTac actually travels in the belly of passenger planes. And so this is what we call belly cargo. And look at the international routes, and so a similar ratio, but talking about different things. About a third overall of our air cargo is on international routes. And when you look at just those international routes, just that third, and you go back again to the belly cargo, how much cargo is actually flying in the passenger planes? On those international routes, it can be close to 2/3 of the capacity for air cargo is belly cargo in those very large long-haul passenger planes. And in fact, if you're flying, or when we were flying to routes to Asia, there could be as much as 30 metric tons of air cargo in the lower hold of the aircraft along with our baggage. Of course, that varies a little bit depending on how many people are on board and how much baggage they bring. But as I've noted, with many of those international flights suspended currently, that capacity to haul international belly cargo is very heavily impacted. And for some routes, it's gone entirely. When the passenger service is suspended to cities in China, Beijing and Shanghai, that are served nonstop out of SeaTac, or as well Hong Kong, then the capacity is just completely for air cargo. And I guess another thing to note about SeaTac Airport, different than most gateway cargo airports in the United States, we are a net exporter. And so we actually have a lot of businesses here in the Pacific Northwest that export by air through SeaTac Airport. And so these passenger flights that are carrying belly cargo internationally, they're very key to certain export, particularly export, some import industries. So for example, we've heard from the shellfish industry and shellfish producers specifically. When these flights were active, they provided a very good mix of attributes to export shellfish. There's a good frequency of these flights. They're every day. It's a very short, direct transit time, and the cost to ship by air cargo can be fairly reasonable in the air freight world. Again, because the economics of that flight, there's passengers on board, they've paid a ticket, and so they're paying for part of that flight. And so from an export freight perspective, that belly cargo capacity is very important. And to markets like in China or Hong Kong, For the shellfish industry in particular, the absence of those flights means that basically they have no availability to ship by air right now. So we're seeing understandably bad results coming in Q1, down 7 to 12% overall. Looking at March, we're off 25 to 30% in terms of the tonnage that's being reported by the airlines. So we also have freighters that fly international routes, Korean, Asiana, China Airlines into Taiwan, Cargolux, Lufthansa, folks like that. But they have limited capacity to expand their services once the belly cargo has been pulled back. Additionally, on the freighter side, you've got a higher cost to ship because the freight's paying for the entire journey there, the airplane, the crew, the fuel, and particularly then when all of this cargo that would like to go to Asia, when it's all competing just for the space remaining on the freighters, then the cost can get bid up as well. And as well, just to add a little bit more misery, we don't have direct freighter service into some of those key markets, particularly into China, Beijing, Shanghai, or in Hong Kong. Those routes out of SeaTac are purely served by the belly cargo. So the flight frequency on the freighters has remained constant. Their volumes, though, are down, associated with the economic issues there in Asia as well as our own, impacting both consumers but as well producers here in the Northwest. So that's some pretty terrible news. But you might be surprised then when you hear myself and others, or you look at our data coming out of the airport for Q1. We are, in fact, air cargo tonnage overall is up. We're in record territory in terms of the volume of air cargo still moving through the airport. We're up 3%, more than 3% in the first quarter. We're even up 1% in March. And so what's going on? We just talked about being down 25 or 30% on the international side, particularly as it relates to belly. Well, so a third of our tonnage is international. That means the other 2/3 is domestic. And domestic air cargo is frankly booming. And although the belly capacity on the domestic side is down as well, with airlines like Delta, Alaska, United, American, Southwest, all suspending, either suspending flights or having a reduced frequency of flights. What we are seeing, though, is there's in fact, the dominant component of our domestic side is e-commerce as well as what we call express, so FedEx and DHL. And as I say, this side of the market is sharply up, and these folks are flying the e-commerce side and the express side. They're flying domestic freighters. So we're seeing Q1 up more than 16% in that component of the market. In March, those freighters for e-commerce and express are up fully 25% in terms of the tonnage that they're reporting. And we can understand why, in particular, e-commerce is having a field day. Our retail buying patterns, to a large extent, are changing as we try to get things. We want to order online and have things delivered to the doorstep as opposed to going out to shop when we can. And because this the domestic side as well as this freighter side is dominant at SeaTac, this is pushing our tonnage up overall. So getting back to international, is there any good news that we can look at currently or in the future? Well, again, when we talk to our shippers, like in the shellfish industry, the Asia markets, they are recovering. They're ahead of us in this wave of impact from the virus. So their demand is pushing up. They would like to see, for example, more exports of consumables like shellfish. Unfortunately, though, with the capacity missing, this is where those productive industries are saying, well, wait a minute, those folks over in our markets want to buy, but we can't get the product shipped to them. So we're seeing some new capacity emerging in the form of airlines now actually flying grounded passenger jets, no passengers on board, but flying the aircraft solely so that they can carry the cargo that normally would be on that plane. And so, for example, at SeaTac, starting this week, starting Wednesday, we saw EVA announce and begin to fly 3 times a week with a 777 passenger jet, purely with a lower hold filled with air cargo. And so no passengers on board. And they're going to do that 3 times a week. And they still even have, I think, 3 times a week of passenger service as well, again, with that belly cargo. So that's one way that airlines can actually kind of return to the market and provide that capacity. We haven't seen it yet at SeaTac, but we've seen at other airports in other markets that airlines may be doing that. But even, and I've seen great pictures of airline flights with boxes stacked in the seats, in addition to cargo in the belly hold. And in fact, now we're hearing that some airlines are, because this is the duration of this event is going longer and longer, some airlines are actually pulling the economy seats out of certain aircraft so that they can bring even more cargo in to the main deck where those seats normally would be, and try to use these grounded passenger planes as much as possible to provide capacity back into the system, both for exports and imports. We're yet to see this at SeaTac. We're also yet to see a return of this type of service to those key trade routes where we've got no capacity at all. So we don't yet have this sort of service into Beijing, Shanghai, or Hong Kong. EVA, of course, they fly into Taipei. So that gets you close, gets you into the Asia marketplace. But if you're an exporter who's exporting something super perishable, like live seafood, these aren't yet effective substitutes for that missing direct belly cargo that we see right now. We also don't know yet if the cost to ship in this manner is going to be acceptable to some of those industries, and so we'll see. So I guess I'll end with a cheerful note as best we can. One of the dominant trade categories at SeaTac Airport and shipping windows, if you will, is our Pacific Northwest cherry export process. Usually about 2 to 3 months in the summer, June, July, and August, where we export tens of thousands of tons of fresh Northwest cherries. Of course, the fruit grows on the trees regardless of the virus. Hopefully, the labor force will be there to harvest in the sufficient numbers that we want to see here in the next month. And a lot of that product actually is exported on pure freighters, many of them chartered, but also additional frequencies from the operators that we have. So, all we can do is plan for the future and be ready to get back to business. And hopefully we'll see, if not a positive cherry season, maybe a limited impact on the exports. So, Sam, that's what I have, and I'm always happy to take questions. I know there's always a lot of questions on the air cargo side because it is pretty complex and pretty arcane. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk.
Thanks, Tom. That's great. And nothing makes me happier than to know that our cherries are going to be okay. I can't wait to start eating those in a couple of months. So we've heard from the air cargo side and the maritime side. Now we're going to turn to what was shown by Steve in that one chart at the bottom. He's showing the supply chain, one of the most important parts of the supply chain, the trucks. Sheri Call is the Executive Vice President of the Washington Trucking Association. She lobbies full-time in Olympia. She's the person who's giving voice to the trucking industry. Without the trucking industry, none of us would have anything to eat or wear or do anything else. So Sheri, look forward to turning it over to you and hearing your thoughts.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I'm pleased to talk a little bit about the trucking industry in Washington, and I'll just point out that 80% of communities in Washington rely solely on trucks to get their goods. We're kind of seeing our heyday in the media spotlight right now, getting attention as the unsung heroes, along with medical care workers and first responders, which we're very grateful for. It's not something that we get to enjoy every single day. So hoping we can figure out how to carry this forward. But just a little bit about the Washington Trucking Associations. I'm an 18-year employee there. We are an organization that is 100% member supported. So we're dependent on the dues that our members pay to support the work that we do. We represent all segments of the industry, including intermodal, which is the local trucks, container trucks that that Steve talked about earlier. Common carriers, which are typically for-hire carriers that go over the road, work also in regional and in local service. These are both truckload and less than truckload carriers, in addition to parcel deliveries. We represent log trucks, dump trucks, household good movers, and then private carriers who typically haul their own product. We're also affiliated nationally with the American Trucking Association and the research wing of the American Transportation Research Institute, which what you're seeing on your screen is an exhibit that they prepare for us every year based on BLS and BTS data for kind of to summarize the facts, fast facts of the industry. So I'm not going to go into great detail on that, but I thought it'd be a better visual for you. I also have 49 state colleagues. There is a trucking association of varying sizes in each state. Some states more significant than others. I will tell you that Washington is, even though we are important in the local economy and the movement of goods and freight in the state, we're not one of the bigger states in the nation in terms of trucking activity. So our job is to advocate, educate, and promote the industry. Right now, operationally, we've been under, we're heavily regulated by the USDOT, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. We have been, right from the get-go, actually, one of the first things they do when a national disaster is declared, whether it be a pandemic or a natural disaster, is to lighten up on the industry's hours of service. So we're restricted to a certain amount of hours per day. In this particular instance, the hours of service are lifted and waived for mostly emergency supplies and equipment, medical supplies, anything related to the COVID or pandemic effort, essentially is under an hours of service waiver. There's also a small weight waiver that was put in place. It doesn't extend our top gross legal weight, but it extends our basically the weight in which we're required to have an overweight permit. If we're licensed for 80,000 pounds, we might have 85,000 pounds before we're actually subject to buying that permit. So a couple of those waivers are in place. We're also, our CDLs are a federal endorsement on our license. So that is a credential, essentially, if your license was good as of March 1st and yet has expired since, because our Department of Licensing offices are not 100% functional right now. We have waivers on our CDLs, same with TWIC cards. I think that just came this week, and I know my Northwest Seaport Alliance partners are very familiar with the TWIC card credentials. we're grateful for all those waivers that we're operating under. I will say that we've had very good feedback and input and collaboration with all the various state agencies that we are that we stakeholder with. Yesterday, we just held a trucking town hall meeting with Department of Licensing, State Patrol. We had, excuse me, State Patrol licensing. We had FMCSA on the line, and gosh, 4 different agencies. I can't remember the 4th one, but you know, just to clear up some of the questions and the rumors and the outstanding issues that have been flying around. That's you know, has been our role, is to keep our members up to date on what is and what is not allowed in this time of crisis, and who's exempt from what, and whether or not they're still able to continue to operate. And so it was nice to have those stakeholder groups on the line. For all segments of the industry, they're all experiencing something different. We are experiencing a reduction in freight already, and depending on the industry segment, it's more severe. We do have folks in the common carrier for hire category that are heavily dependent on manufacturing, and the simple fact is, until we get many of the economic sectors actively operating in Washington, our industry will continue to struggle. We anticipate as much as a 40% drop in freight in Washington, mainly in terms of home construction, residential construction, commercial construction, all phases of manufacturing, auto sales, and then of course import and export activity. I'm happy to hear that thanks to airplanes, the fruit and produce that we're growing is getting to markets that are used to getting it, so there won't be a problem there. But I think what we're seeing in general is buying is slowing down. I think the reality of a smaller paycheck are probably hitting the millions of people that are collecting unemployment right now. I'm told there's a oversupply of perishable foods. Just this morning was having a conversation with a meat producer who said basically now's the time to buy cheap prime rib because there's not a huge demand for it, and you can get it very cheap. I'm told that raw milk is essentially being disposed of because it's picked up every single day and has to be processed, but the demand for it has reduced. So again, there's a lot of just a lot of those types of anecdotal things that I can share with you. One of the concerns that we have because of the makeup of the industry, we are, you know, while we do have some very large companies within our membership, our companies in Washington are largely small business. About 97% of those companies are fewer than 5 trucks. And so that leaves us as a very highly fragmented industry, lacking the ability to qualify for some of these big, you know, government bailouts that are happening. I know airlines are, you know, a lot more consolidated than we are. And that, you know, I don't know if that's going to cause us an issue in the long run, but we do see that as kind of a problem, I guess, for our industry. The one thing I wanted to mention, since we have the Northwest Seaport Alliance on here, is just the, it's, as you all know, it's just been a weird year entirely for port activity and for those container trucks. We seem to have members who, if they're well diversified in storage and warehousing, not so much heavily dependent on just the trucking activity, are actually doing very well right now because of product. And I think Seaport Alliance can probably speak better to this, but with the threat of tariffs that were oncoming toward the end of the year and the start of the year, that pushed a lot of freight through our ports. We have a typical slowdown for the Lunar New Year from about a month, and that's something we totally expect. But then the COVID virus hits in China, and that heavily impacted freight that was coming from China, not to mention the manufacturing and all the activity that goes on behind that. And then of course it hits the United States, and here in Washington was started out as ground zero. Should be pretty proud of ourselves for actually overcoming that reputation. But so it's just been a mixed bag really for our industry. There's definitely an oversupply of capacity right now for the trucking industry, which is, obviously bad news for these many small businesses, in some cases who have laid off 2/3 of their workforce. In some cases, because of the 06, 07 financial crisis, are well prepared and have told their workforce that they're not going to lay them off as long as we can anticipate that the shelter in place order would end as of May 4th. So we'd be looking at something like a 6-week time period. And then if we can anticipate that coming to an end, then folks can move ahead and they can start planning. What I can see at least is still products that are in short supply with regard to medical products and masks and supplies. I know that there's been a call out by the governor for local manufacturers to pivot into producing those types of things, and we've actually gotten companies that have reached out to us to say, we have these available, can you advertise it for us? And so we're putting that information out everywhere we can. ATA, our national affiliate, had come across 50,000 masks, not N95 masks, which they're offering to the state associations. And so what we did was bought a bulk amount of those masks, and we're turning around and reselling them at cost to our smaller businesses. We're a bit concerned that most of these things are being sold in bulk quantities of 100, and we have lots of companies that have 12 or fewer employees that just need enough to get through the crisis, and then obviously hopefully worry about stocking up on reasonable supplies when all of this is over for potentially a future pandemic. Hopefully not, but so that's kind of just where we are. It's probably not a whole lot, but I will stop there, and happy to take any questions when the time comes.
Thanks, Sheri, very much. Appreciate that. Fascinating. I believe we're going to go to our Q&A session. And while we're waiting for people to put questions in the queue, maybe Renata, is it okay if I ask a question while we're waiting for that? So for all three panelists, what does your industry, your clients, your membership most need, you think, from federal, local, state governments as they're trying to figure out their policies? Is there something you're hearing from your clients, tenants, members that they really wish they could get as they're trying to deal with this ongoing pandemic? Look, Sheri, go ahead and unmute yourself.
There we go. Thank you. Yeah, I think our biggest thing is just, again, a return to normal economic activity. And we realize that that's going to happen with a great deal of planning and care. And we're just obviously supportive and anxious to see that type of thing move forward. I think trucking is kind of the front line of that process, as you saw from Tom's great graphic. Manufacturer, producer, and then it's transportation. So whether it's truck, train, pipeline, whatever it might be, we need those processes at the front end to be up and functioning in order for us to anticipate staying busy. So
that's great. Steve or Tom, any answers on that question? I'm not sure I actually see them.
I mean, we're fortunate that we were trying to be proactive on that from a regulatory side of that. We had our whole industry, including trucking and air, declared as an essential business, so we were allowed to stay open. So I think ensure that is that support is there from the state in terms of ensuring that the entire supply chain is considered essential. So it's not just the port, it's not just the airport, it's also the warehousing, it's the trucking,
Steve, I'm sorry to interrupt.
just
Your audio is pretty choppy, so we're not actually able to hear what you're saying now. Do you want to, can we pause and maybe start a couple sentences back?
Or maybe we could go to Tom, maybe, or, Tom, and then come back to Steve. I know if it's like my internet connection, sometimes it's good, and then you pause, you have to come back to it.
Tom, you there?
So I think Tom might be frozen. Oh, wait, there he is.
I can try again. Can you hear me?
Yeah, let's try again.
Okay. All right.
So
yeah,
the audio does
no.
seem difficult for.
Well, why don't we start back up with Steve, and then Tom will come to you here in a second, if technology allows it.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly where but I just basically bottom line is ensuring that the entire supply chain industry maintains its status as essential, so that everyone bring the terminal or the airport, it's truckers, it's the rest stops, it's the warehouses that store the goods, is recognizance of this deemed it essential. And then
Sorry, Steve. Sorry, Steve. I'm gonna paraphrase what I thought you said, and then we'll probably just move on a little bit, just because it is pretty choppy. But essentially, we need to continue to advocate and ensure that everyone along that line of the supply chain is still deemed and protected as an essential service. And that we continue to support everyone along that line, so that we can, be poised as well to mitigate what's happening with the pandemic, and then as well for recovery. So again, really appreciate those thoughts. And okay, good, perfect. That's great. All right. Anyone else have another answer to Sam's question, and then I have a question.
Yeah, so are you able to hear me okay? Great. So yeah, I think it's very important, again, on the airport side, talking about essential businesses, obviously the supply chain that moves through the airport as air cargo. We're very pleased to see that, those businesses are still able to operate, and that the airport will remain open for this commercial side. So even if, as we hear, nobody's flying anymore, is the airport going to stay open? The airport stays open for business and commerce. It might be that I'm getting my own personal dream. We're becoming a cargo airport. We're becoming a freighter airport. I say that humorously, of course. We're usually the 5 or 6%er there at the airport, so this is our time to shine. But we want to make sure that these businesses stay open, that the folks can come to work, and that those businesses change their processes so that everybody is as safe as possible while they conduct this important business. On the federal side, the monetary relief to the airlines and to the airport have been very important. It's going to allow the airlines to continue to operate, even if they're not, clearly not operating profitably. These federal benefits are going to be helpful. Again, on the airport side, I know that that's been emerging just this week in terms of the federal benefit to keeping the airports themselves open. able to pay salaries and debt service and do all the kind of things they need to do. And then I think lastly, flexibility that we're seeing, for example, in terms of safety rules and regulations. I was talking about airlines loading cargo into the passenger areas of the aircraft, or even taking the seats out and carrying cargo in that way. That's not the way that the industry and these methods are supposed to work. And so there's concerns about, well, can you do it safely? And we're seeing that flexibility coming from those folks who have rules and regulations saying, you know, be safe, do your safety risk assessments, but, you know, go ahead and operate in these ways that seem unconventional.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tom. So my question, again, you know, as organizations and leaders that are advocating for, you know, more opportunity, you know, for our industry, and especially when we talk about trade and logistics, with Washington being such a trade dependent state and so many jobs being dependent on, you know, global trade, how can we all work together more collaboratively, as you said, Tom, a little bit more creatively? Is it on the advocacy side, you know, just joining forces together to, as you mentioned, Sheri, talking about, you know, how the tariffs were really starting to, you know, impact, you know, things. You know, what are your thoughts or feelings on just, you know, how businesses and communities can, you know, collaborate and think creatively to support our community in regards to, you know, global trade, supply chain management?
I'll attempt anyway. That's a really good question. You know, we actually early on, I was actually quite overwhelmed by, we had a request from the Grocers Association, the Food Industry Association, because there's such a demand to fill orders, you know, for a period of time that were, I want to say I saw a statistic of something on the lines of typically filling 80,000 orders a week per warehouse, and they were up to 130 and 130,000 orders per week that they were working on. And so they kind of put a call out to the trucking industry to see if there was any help that we could offer. And, you know, of course, there's a lot of trucks that were not working at the time that our members would love to be, you know, putting to work. And so we put a call out to capacity and just got overwhelmed with the calls that we were getting saying, please add us to the list, please, you know, forward our information. We're not typically grocery haulers, but we can take our tractor and attach it to, you know, someone's trailer. So there was, you know, it became apparent very quickly that there was much more capacity than there was need for that. I think what they needed were warehouse workers. They just needed people who were not just able but willing to work the demanding hours and under those conditions that they were being required to work. And I think that's where just all of us as businesses and every one of us as citizens need to recognize and show our support and appreciation for these folks, because it's, you know, again, frontline healthcare workers, frontline truck drivers, just you know, everybody who's on the front line, including those grocery workers, shelf stockers, people that don't normally get recognized for the work they do. I think it's upon all of us to recognize those. We, as an association, over the past 2 weeks, served 800 meals to truck drivers, and the main advantage that we got from that is to be able to look them in the eye and say thank you. And we got so many, you know, shout outs on Twitter and voice messages from these truck drivers that were absolutely touched by that type of recognition. I mean, it was a $5 lunch, and yet just to be told, we appreciate you, we thank you for being out here. And I think that just, you know, honestly needs to extend all across supply chain functions and care functions everywhere. So
You might add a couple of things to that. That's great, Sheri. I'll say two things. The second one might be more controversial than the first. The first one is mostly people ignore the supply chain and don't think about it at all. But this has really brought how important the supply chain is front and center. When you cannot get swabs and agents to do tests, when suddenly there's toilet paper running out of your store, you really start to think, people for the first time think about the supply chain. We did a study abroad trip and we brought students to Wenatchee, and they learned about how apples are grown and how they're packaged and how they're shipped to retail and all the way over to Vietnam. One of our students, after going through this, said, I had no idea how complicated it was for an apple to get to my table. So I think it's really important for all of us to start to think about that. And I think this maybe provides an opportunity to provide more information and awareness about supply chains and how important they are and how important the people working in them are. The second thing I'll say, which may be slightly more controversial, is a lot of things are being relaxed just to deal with the emergency, including regulations. I'm sitting here in my home office. There's really no OSHA rules whatsoever for my home office here, and probably for other people as well in their home offices. And I think this gives an opportunity for us to look at all of our regulations on businesses and figure out what is really truly necessary or what can be changed somewhat and or made easier to adapt to. Because we've seen a lot of regulatory failures in our response to the pandemic, everything from at the top with FDA and CDC on testing, but to a bunch of other things as well. I think this is a great opportunity to look at it in a bipartisan way. It's not a right or a left viewpoint. It's just, okay, what can we do to make our regulatory environment work better for our whole society?
I would, I agree wholeheartedly there, Sam. Sometimes it's a little distressing to see, where we're currently going with some of the regulatory rollback. I agree with you and Sheri as well that, this is a time that people are, the supply chain, all elements of it, whether it's, different modes on the road, ocean, air, and e-commerce, it's getting a lot more visibility. I hope people learn more about the supply chain, that it isn't just something that appears during an emergency to fly in relief products, that it's a robust industry that happens sort of quietly all around us all of the time. I know there has been quite a lot of announced hiring of folks, particularly on the e-commerce side, to try to handle these vastly increased volumes of e-commerce orders. I would. It's interesting from a federal side and from our ability to lobby and influence federal policy. We're not for this very tragic virus incident that we have been looking at here now for more than 3 months. Were it not for this calamity, I think we'd still be talking about the considerable impacts to international trade that is related to our federal trade policy and tariffs. And so, we've all kind of forgotten about that while we worry about something that is more immediate and more dire. But of course, that isn't something that we can completely forget about. And all of us who are involved in international trade and involved in particularly export industries, and they're all around us here in the Northwest. We would love to see a return to an easier federal policy when it comes to tariffs and trade barriers. So I think that's something that sort of goes on in the background, that we still want to see time and energy spent in resolving some of those issues.
Great. That's something that, we always say at our chamber is, we're, not anti-policy or, anti-regulation, but we are for smart policy and smart regulation, right? And, especially with our SMART series, the Southside, Mitigation and Recovery Taskforce, that's what we're all trying to do. So I don't know if anyone else has any final thoughts. I'm going to share my screen with our contact information for just a closing. It has the information on our website where we will post this video later. And so I guess just final round, any last thoughts as we close out?
I was just going to add, Sheri, again, roadway conditions have never been better for trucking, and I wish we'd figure out a way to keep it up.
I'll just reiterate something I said in this is Sam. Something I said in my presentation is, the only way we get out of this is all working together, whether on the healthcare side, supply chain side, or other sides. The virus doesn't care about our petty squabbles, and so we need to all work together to make it better.
So good. I did see a hand raised a while back, and I just want to make sure that that question or that comment got addressed. I didn't catch whose hand it was, and it might have been in relation to some of the audio issues, but whoever had their hand up earlier, please put it up again if you do still want to ask your question. Other than that, I have no other comments.
Perfect. So again, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to Sam. Thank you to Sheri, to Steve, to Tom. Really appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise, your thoughts, your insight, again, as we, all move forward together. We're going to get out of this together and really appreciate the opportunity to connect with you this morning, this afternoon. Again, every Friday from 11 until 1 o'clock, we have time scheduled for these webinars. Appreciate it if you can join us. More information again on the screen there, seattle-southsidechamber.com. Founded on the belief that we're better, stronger together. Again, thank you so much. Enjoy your weekend. Take care, everyone. Be well, stay well.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everybody.